Hi, I'm Caroline Levitt. I'm the co-founder of A Mighty Blaze, the book initiative that was begun days after the pandemic, actually, by myself and Jenna Blum to help authors, independent bookstores, and readers. And we've grown like so huge. And today I'm completely thrilled and honored because one of my literary heroines is here. And I know from the level of interest that it's probably one of yours also, Alice McDermott. Alice McDermott is the author of a zillion novels. Her eighth novel, The Ninth Hour, was published by Farrar Straus Giroux. Her seventh novel was Someone. It was a New York Times bestseller, a finalist for the Dublin IMPAC Award, the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Patterson Prize for Fiction, and the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Someone was also longlisted for the National Book Award. Three of her previous novels, After This, At Weddings and Wakes, and That Night, were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize. Charming Billy won the National Book Award for Fiction in 1998 and was a finalist for the Dublin IMPAC Award. That Night was also a finalist for the National Book Award, the Penn Faulkner Award, and the Los Angeles Book Prize. It's also a lovely movie. Her stories, essays, and reviews have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Yorker, Harper's, and elsewhere. She's received the Whiting Writers Award, the Carrington Award for Literary Excellence, and the F. Scott Fitzgerald Award for American Literature. In 2013, she was inducted into the New York State Writers Hall of Fame. She's a professor of humanity at Johns Hopkins. Welcome, Alice. I'm so thrilled to have you here. We were talking a little bit just before this got on, and I mentioned that my claim to fame is that when your very first novel, A Bigamist's Daughter, came out, it was on the front page of the New York Times Book Review, and it was the same issue where my review was for my debut, though my debut was, of course, a much smaller review and more in the middle, not on the front page, but I still consider that an honor. So we're going to be talking about What About the Baby? Some Thoughts on the Art of Fiction. And this is exactly the book that every writer and every reader needs to read. It's just tremendous. So thank you for being here, Alice. Welcome.
Thank you, Caroline. And I'm so happy that we shared that issue. That thrilling first novel reviewed in the New York Times Book Review issue. It never fades.
Never fades.
That's astonishing.
So what I loved so much about this book is, first of all, it's very down to earth, and it's also incredibly intimate, and it also tells you things that you do not know. One of the first things that you said is, at some point when you're writing, every novel is a shipwreck. I found that so comforting. First of all, because it's true. And second of all, because it actually gives the writer hope. A lot of times when writers are talking on social media or in interviews about their books, they talk about the pleasure of it, but they don't talk about the shipwreck. And I feel that that is important. So would you say that the whole aspect of writing, in particular a novel, is both the joys of it as well as the terrors, and we need to embrace both?
Yes, certainly I would say that. Now, whether it's self-deluding, that's something we all have to ask only ourselves in our hearts. The terrible part is what gets us to the wonderful part. I don't think any of us would pass up getting through the terrible part and going straight to the wonderful part. But I do think it's that, it's the marvelous mystery of the creative arts, any of them, that even the author, the artist herself, isn't always quite sure of where the art is taking her.
Yes. Yes, you mentioned another story, which is actually the title of the book, What About the Baby, which explains so much so beautifully about how we find our stories, especially when we feel lost. Would you mind telling that story, the What About the Baby story?
It became a kind of refrain in some of the writing workshops that I taught, and The short of it is that years ago, a friend of mine was leading a film discussion group in an assisted living facility, and the first film that she chose was Julia. Based on Pentimento, the memoir, Lillian Hellman's memoir. And my friend chose it because at that time, most of the ladies were the World War II greatest generation. And she thought this would be a wonderful way for them to talk about their own memories of that time. And anyone who's familiar with the book or the film knows that there's a wonderful scene where Lillian Hellman's friend Julia has met with Lillian in Berlin. They're passing some money and they hadn't seen each other for a while. And Julia tells Lillian Hellman that she's had a baby and she has sent the baby across the German border to be cared for by some French bakers because Julia's working with the underground. And at the end of the movie, there is indeed a scene of Lillian Hellman, played by Jane Fonda, going in and out of bakeries, sort of obviously asking about this child, but we never find out what's happened to her. Well, the film is over. My friend thinks she's going to have all these great memories from her ladies. And the first question was, what about the baby? What happened to the baby?
Yeah.
And my friend tried to explain, well, yes, look, she never did find out what happened to the baby, did she? And the ladies rebelled. They said, something happened to the baby. The baby must be somewhere. It's a terrible story if you don't tell us what happened to the baby. We don't care about the Nazis. We don't care about the plays. We don't care about Jane Fonda and her beautiful hat. We want to know what happened to the baby. And I use that with students just as a, maybe to point out characters who drop out, themes that don't get developed. But also as a way to think about what an author owes her characters.
Right. And that, to me, I mean, did it feel to you, did you have the same question when you were watching that? Like, what happened to the baby? It feels to me that even if you don't go deeply into it, the fact that the baby was given away has got to have shaped her character in some major way. And that must be something that as readers we'd want to know, although certainly the story is great.
Yes, right.
Bakery.
And I suppose this is the pass that I give memoir that I don't give to fiction. It's true. And there, of course, there's some debate with how true Lillian Hellman's story
Right, I know that.
right, but it's presented as memoir. And so the truth of it is she never found the baby. And journalism and memoir can say, I know it's a shame, but the baby was never discovered. A novelist doesn't quite have that leeway. A novelist has created the baby. You're not going to make use of the baby. Don't put the baby in your story. You didn't have to do that. This is your world. You've created this baby. And I guess that speaks to really to the heart of the refrain. Not so much that you've dropped a stitch here in telling the story, but more that if you have created a character, then don't you owe something to that character, and don't you owe it to the reader to in some way make sense of this world that you've created? Because even if we can argue all day about whether real life is the product of an intelligent creator, you can't argue that about novels.
Right.
The world of a novel is created by an intelligence. The degree of intelligence we can debate, but no one picks up a novel and says, I don't really believe anybody wrote this.
Right. That's right. That's right.
No, there's a creative intelligence behind a story that's created. That's a piece of fiction.
Okay, I just want to show the cover again. Okay. The other thing that I particularly loved about this book was that it's always so comforting when you hear a master of the form talk about struggling with the form and early struggling. And one story that I loved it, you had written in some book, this is after a bigamous daughter, and you were 200 pages in, and it was about a woman whose life is upended when she had a child who had an illness. And that novel got discarded because that night sort of popped up, and in
Mhm.
an amazing, amazing way. I would love it if you would talk about that, like how that happened and how were you able to let go of this novel about the child with the illness? Like, what made you know this is not the novel I need to write right now, but that night is?
Yeah, I think, and unfortunately, this has happened to me many times in my writing career, but I've seen it happen with writers over my years of teaching as well. And I think that is that sense that what you know about the story has outrun your writing of the story. So
That's
you,
so interesting.
yeah,
That's
you know the story so well. You've got it all planned out, and maybe you've written
right.
an outline and you've taken lots of notes and you've told people about it. Um, so then the working at words, the creation of the sentence, which is at heart the thing we do, uh,
Yeah,
lacks discovery. The things that we look for as readers, to be surprised and delighted, to
right.
see things we know we never would have seen if we hadn't picked up this novel or this short story. Um, those things are not happening for the first reader of this story, which is the writer herself. So it was a kind of over familiarity with the story that I thought I wanted to tell. And so that, the hard work of creating sentences and getting the details right and getting the rhythm right and just using language as well as you are capable of using it begins to feel too much of a burden because I'm not having any fun here. I'm
Right.
not learning anything. I'm not discovering. I'm not being that astonished and delighted first reader of my own work. I'm being the one going, yeah, yeah, yep, yep. And then this
Right.
happened.
That's right. That's right. That's funny because I always end up with these writer's synopsis and outlines, and I think, okay, now I know what I'm writing. And
Got
then
it.
once I'm deep in it, it changes, and then I have to sort of rip up the outline because it's not that book anymore. But
No,
that
right.
to me is the pleasure of being in that weird sort of subconscious zone where things do happen and do surprise you. So, did any part of that book, do you still have those 200 pages? Have you used them in anything, or are they just sort of quietly sitting in a drawer?
Yeah, very quietly. I think what happened was the characters were sort of slipping out of the roles that I had already defined for them, and I found myself sort of resisting. The characters wanted to talk about childhood memories. They wanted to talk about where they'd grown up, and I, being the taskmaster, because I knew what the story was that they were in, um, I kept pulling back on that, and that's when I realized, well, maybe whatever's going on in my life or whatever, I have to attend to this thematic thing that is disrupting, that is being disobedient. you know so I literally, I mean, I laugh at myself now, because I was in a little writer's residency and I had a cottage and I had a desk and I had this novel and I had a contract for it and it was my second novel and I knew what I was going to do. And then I had this other thing that was interfering. So I literally would write at the kitchen table in my little cottage as if I was sort of having another room affair, away
It's
from the
like
novel I was supposed to be writing. Like, don't tell anyone, but here's a story. And eventually I realized, oh, this is what it's like to write a story you don't know, and to learn the story as you write it, and to have the story reveal itself to you through the language itself. This is what that's like, and that's not happening with that other story. So long. other story.
It's amazing because when you read that night, I picked it up to reread it again before this interview, and I realized that so much of that story, as a reader, you don't, even though I knew what happened in the book and I knew what the book was about, in reading it, I didn't know. You were just thrust into this really visceral, intimate world where something was happening. And you knew, I just got the feeling something is going to happen, and I don't know what it is yet, but I'll be damned if I put the book down before I find out. So it's almost like that your whole story about that particular book actually gives us all permission not to have to know how is the book going to end? Like, what are we trying to say? Because a lot of times you don't know until you're done writing the book, correct?
Yeah, and I think that's we have to give credit to the process.
Right.
And I think understandably, number one, we all want to be finished. We all want to have a book coming out, not a book under construction. And
Yeah.
these temptations are there for all of us, or a book that's already out. So I think thinking about that sometimes keeps us from acknowledging the magic of the process, the magic of getting it right, sentence by sentence, of calling up our best efforts in our use of language, of all those things that any writer, I think, sets out to do, but can easily forget when other pressures that have
Right.
to do with publishing and
Oh,
getting
yeah.
out there, come to the fore. So as I say, the sentence shape, rhythm, language, detail, honoring the story, making it new, not settling for the familiar, saying it the best way you can. When I was just writing my first novel, my editor, who's still my editor all these years later, had a wonderful phrase that he wrote once or twice in the margins. And I've used it so many times as a teacher myself. And it was simply, is this as good as it can be?
Wow. How did
Uh,
that initially make you feel? I would have been devastated initially, but then I would have gotten to work.
I mean, the wonderful and delightful thing was, and this is why I've used it myself, uh, in every instance, I knew he was right, and I knew I was trying to get away with it.
Okay.
I was never, well, yes, I never. Every single instance was like, yeah, I know. I just put that down. I didn't want to rewrite that. It's good enough. And I think that sort of mentoring a young writer with that very delicate question, not I'm going to tell you how to make this better,
Right. How do you do it?
but simply this is your book, this is your language, this is your style, but is this as good as you can make it? Um,
That's a great question.
it's
Um,
lovely.
so this fabulous book, What About the Baby? And everybody out there, please, if you have questions, comments, put them in the chat and we'll get to them. This is your first work of nonfiction. So what was that like? Did you feel like you were using another part of your brain? Or did you feel like, oh, I'm going to be telling everything I know about writing, and what if some of it isn't right for somebody out there reading? What was it like? What was the whole process like for you?
Well, most of these, or many of them, were lectures that I had delivered. Many of them at the Sewanee Writers Conference. Some at other writers' conference were teaching. Some are brief essays that I was asked to write. So they were always addressed to an audience, or I had in my mind an audience of fellow writers. Because I delivered most of them orally, I always had that sense, well, I can change it as I go along.
Oh,
You know,
right.
I can amend it. If I read this paragraph and then say, well, that's not always true, I can tell the audience that. So it's a little bit intimidating when you take something that you've written to deliver aloud, and now know it's going to be in print, and you can't constantly amend. So that was a little strange. I mean, I resist. I have no desire, not even a speculative dream to ever write a memoir. Fiction is what I do. It's what interests me and drives me. So I am a little bit, and I still feel a little sheepish about using the non-fictional first person pronoun so often. you know, that was hard to get over.
Well, it's an incredibly helpful and actually very comforting book. I mean, I was it's doing really, really well, and it's been racking up the raves about it. I wanted to you also talk about the difference between a gorgeous sentence and beautiful language and the story itself, which is something that writers always talk about. Like, what do you for a while, there was this thing where people said, "Well, a literary book is where the language is beautiful." And maybe there's not much of a plot. And a commercial novel is where the plot is great, but the language is just sort of sweeps you away. I don't think that's true anymore, but I would like to know, like, do you feel that the story matters more to you than the beautiful language? For you, what comes first?
Oh, I don't think you can separate them.
Okay.
I don't think they can be separated at all. I think the thing itself, the artifact of the novel, is all those things. Again, if it's a good story, just tell it to somebody. Call somebody up, put it in an email. Pour a glass of wine and tell your best friend a good story. Done. But a novel is a creation of a world
Mhm.
and also a story, and also a kind of homage to the miraculous things that words alone can do, and also thematic, and also metaphorical, and um,
Right.
so I think parsing the different aspects too much sort of again moves us away
Yes.
from,
Mhm.
isn't this marvelous? It's just marks on a page. And I enter into it, and it's as important as many of the most important experiences of my life. Or I can return to it 20 years later and relive it in all its vividness, something we can't do in life.
Right. Right, and I wish we
There
could.
Yeah, there are all these wonderful things. I mean, I try to talk a little bit about I think and I see so many sort of beginning novelists make this mistake, that wanting to be a literary writer, which means I have to use beautiful
Right,
language,
right.
which usually means that the word luminescence is going to appear somewhere
Right.
on the first page, because there's the signal.
That's
Luminescence, gossamer. I got it.
right.
But it's I think it's Eudora Welty, who talked about that there has to be something inadvertent about beauty, all beauty, and so that if you're as a writer, you're aiming for that beautiful sentence. It's the beautiful sentence is not going to exist
Right.
outside of character and emotion and metaphor and setting. So I think of it more as, don't struggle for beauty, struggle for authenticity.
Yeah, I love that.
Look for the truth of your character, of,
Mhm.
of the world you're creating, of the story you're telling. Tell it straight, tell it honestly, and in the course of doing that, um, your language will rise to the occasion. And you may end up saying something rather beautiful.
Yeah, I'm glad you spoke about that because I have writing students who are always really, really concerned about how I should write this book. I've heard from them that if I write it in first person, it'll be literary. If I write it in present tense, it'll be literary. And my question is always, but doesn't it depend on the story? I mean, if you write a first person novel about one last bank heist, might not be literary, even if it is in present tense with beautiful language. But you have said, let the story find you. What does that mean?
Um, Again, a little bit what we were talking about is not bringing the completed, fully outlined, you know, totally defined story to the page. But I think it's also, opening yourself up to the mystery of your own creation. That Frank O'Connor says at one point in his book about the short story that the only thing a writing teacher really can do is look at a student's work and go, why the boy? Why the tree? Why the pub? Why the dog? What are you thinking? Why are you putting this down? Again, this is created. You're making this up.
Right.
From
Right.
the first word you put down, the first sentence, you're making choices. And in the initial composition, you can't stop yourself to say, "Why am I doing this? Why am I doing this?" But at some point in the process, you do need to ask yourself that,
Right.
and you have to be open to saying, "I don't know why I put that down. I sense, I intuit there's something right here. There's something right about this character. There's something right about this opening scene. I need to keep writing so that I can understand it."
Exactly.
That's just
Exactly.
sort of letting the story find you rather than dictating to the story, and sort of freezing it in your initial impulse to tell it.
That's great. You also wrote about how readers influence what they read by their own backgrounds, just as a writer's background influences what they write. And as soon as I saw that, I thought that's so true. That's why not all books are for all readers. If you've written a book about, say, an adoption gone horribly wrong, a book critic who has an adoption that went horribly wrong or terrifically right might not be the best person to review that book. And so I was wondering, is that something that writers should think about as they're writing? Or I'm betting that you're going to say no. They shouldn't think about it. They should just think about the story. Am I right?
Again, I beat my writing students over the head with this metaphor, but it works, and that is the long list of things you have to lock out of the room when you're composing a story. Um, and it's almost everything. you know, it's book critics, it's readers, it's your family, it's all the obligations that you have, it's everything you've written in the past. It's the writers you have been comparing yourself to, or whose careers you think you would like to emulate. You have to lock all that stuff out and put yourself at the service of your characters and your story. And do that for a while. Do that for a good while. Pursue that. Again, that sense of honesty, authenticity. Don't worry about what other people are publishing. Don't worry about what's in the newspaper that morning. That's not your job. Your job is the story itself. It's putting whatever talent you have, whatever intelligence, whatever energies, whatever imagination you have, you give that to your tale, to the sentences, to the characters. And nothing else can get in the way, not in those initial moments, and days and weeks of composition. So yeah, you can think about that. You can't think about, I, you know, we are our own first readers,
Right.
and
That's
we write fiction because we have read fiction. I hear some writers occasionally say, "I was never a reader, I just became a writer." I don't believe them.
no, I don't believe that
It
either.
doesn't make any sense. It absolutely doesn't make any sense. I started playing the piano. I didn't know what a piano was, and I'd never heard it played before, but I
Right.
started playing. It makes no sense. So I think you have to trust that. The thing
Mhm.
that's driven you to the page to try your own hand is your experience as a reader.
Do you
So you're a great reader already. You know what moves you.
Right, that's right, and that's important. Do you feel that one book is a progression from the next for you? Like, do you feel like you learn certain things in, say, one book and you can apply to the next book? Or do you feel like every book is its own new thing and you don't take anything from the past experience with it?
Yeah, I think at one time I hoped I would accrue all kinds of expertise, um, but I have
Doesn't work
not
that
in
way.
my experience, that has not been the case, and in some ways, I think, again, that's one of the things you do have to look outside the room, anything you've already written, because here now you're telling a new story. Here now you're creating a new world, you're creating new characters, and what you've done in the past, that belonged to that story. Um,
That's right, and it belongs
yeah,
to a different
but it's
time.
also that, you are forever a novice, and there's something, also thrilling about that, you know, scary, it's not like, "Well, this is a lousy paragraph, but I remember 2 books ago, I wrote a great paragraph, so that must make this lousy paragraph." No, absolutely not. It's still a lousy paragraph. You're gonna have to work on it.
That's very funny. I want to ask our great producer, Ollie, do we have questions? Okay. Oh, yes. Oh, it's a Caroline classic. I actually had that listed as one of my other questions. Yes. What's obsessing you now?
Oh, well, I'm sort of, up to my elbows in 2 novels, and,
Two again at the same time?
yeah,
Oh, I
yes,
love it.
terrible way to work, but one is pulling ahead, and so I'm in the I do things sort of backwards, I do most of my research after I pretty much have, a good working, draft of the novel, so I'm moving into the research phase, so I am at different times obsessed with what, what else I need to know in order to make this novel, what it should be.
That's so interesting. It's really a torn between two lovers sort of situation with the two books at once. I have found myself doing that, and I realized the reason why I did it is because it made me less anxious because I felt like, well, if this one is terrible, I always have that one.
Yeah, it is. It's a kind of failsafe.
Yeah.
I'm sure. If I were to psychoanalyze myself, I'm sure it is. It's all about my insecurities. So that if you just want to toss one, you're not starting all over again. I'm sure it's part of that. Some of it is sort of writing to the side. I mean, I know plenty of fiction writers who write novels and then they write short stories as well, simultaneously, so to speak. And that doesn't strike me as so strange. So I love short stories, and occasionally I write them, but I don't think of myself as a short story writer. So off to the side, I write another novel.
I always think of short stories as brief, intense affairs, where writing a novel is like a long marriage. And I like the ins and outs of it. I wanted to know, have you ever given advice to a writer and then realized, oh my God, I don't feel that's the wrong advice. I don't feel that anymore about that advice.
Oh, I used to grow impatient. I have to confess, with student writers who would come into my office and say they were stuck because they just couldn't make up their minds over telling the story in the first person or in limited third person. And they would talk about the pros and the cons and the books that they liked that were in first person and the books that they liked that were in limited third person. And they would start, extrapolating what the whole story was going to be, just talking about it, not writing it. And I would find myself silently saying, oh, for God's sake, just make a decision. It's not that different.
Oh, I love that. I love that.
um,
That's
but with my own novel, Someone, I wrote most of it in the third person, and felt something wasn't right, and was really coming very close to handing it over to my publisher when I realized I had taken away my character's voice by writing
Oh,
it in the
that's interesting.
limited third person. It was still there somewhat, but there was a sort of a scrim of the author um, somewhere in that, and it became essential to me. And I realized I had to rewrite it in the first person and give the story over to this character's voice completely. Let her tell her own story, because it was a story about a woman who never had the chance to tell her own story. And
Oh,
I come in telling it in the third person.
that's
Yeah, so I did cringe a little bit about all the times I had said, "Oh, for God's sake, it really doesn't make that much difference. Just write, just write."
Ollie, do we have any other questions? What are your thoughts about withholding knowledge from the reader, even if the protagonist knows the secret information?
Sounds like cheating.
Ah, that's
I
interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, again, if you think of yourself as the author, completely at the service of the character, not at the service of the reader, at the service of the character, at the service of the world, um, then if this is our point of view character, and we know what this character knows in some instances, um, then it's the author who's getting in the way by not letting us know what the character knows in all instances. Um, so is there a and plus that's familiar. There's the other thing. There's that other monkey on our backs that we need to be aware of, and that is make it new, tell it in a
Right.
way it's never been told. So it's a familiar trope. There are writers, as Flannery O'Connor said, you can write whatever you can get away with, you just can't get away with much. This is the problem with rules and with books about writing. On the other hand, a writer a writer can get away with anything she can get away with. So if you can make it believable, and if you can withhold information without manipulating the character, um, uh, sure, make it work. But yeah, it's a familiar trope, and it's used by I won't name any names, but a lot of lesser writers as a trick of storytelling, not as an authentic and sincere way of creating a believable world.
Okay. Do we have any more questions, Ollie? We have time for two more, and I'm going to snag one of them because I have a question. Okay, well then I'll ask you the question. I'm sure you don't remember this, but I met you at a literary festival a few years ago, and I came up and introduced myself to you. And you were just so down to earth and so completely lovely, and I get that impression that that's exactly the way you are. So I want to know, how do you, having had so much fame and recognition and all this other stuff, how do you stay so humble? I have the feeling that you don't really think about fame or prizes, that you just think about the work. Is that correct? Because that sounds like really good advice if it is.
I guess maybe I'm skeptical. I'm not so sure about that. I gave a reading last month, and afterwards, a woman came up to me and she said, "Oh, I saw you on the Flannery O'Connor documentary." And I said, I was with Talking Head on it, and I said, "Oh yeah, yeah." And she said, "You were the only one they interviewed that I'd never heard of."
Oh no!
I was like,
Oh no! That's
"Okay,
hilarious.
yeah, no, I can. I'm not a Flannery O'Connor scholar. And there were lots of scholars in that. Sure, um, the world will take you down,
Yes, it will.
so easily. and painlessly or painfully, depends on how you react to it. You know, doing what we do, you know, the so-called literary novel, the dying art of literary creation. Um, you know, I don't see it as a source of of ego building, you know. But when it comes down to it, yeah, it's the work itself. It's the
I love
experience of a no of being in a beautifully crafted story, whether it's your own or someone else's. That's what it's all about, and that's what we should be grateful for.
that's right. Again, oh, the lighting is so terrible on my end. This is the cover. It's a beautiful cover. What about the baby? It's about writing fiction by the incomparable Alice McDermott. Alice, thank you so much for being here. We encourage everybody out there to buy the book at your favorite independent bookstore. Do you have a favorite independent bookstore, Alice, that you'd like to call out?
I would call out Politics and Prose just down the road
Okay.
here, and the wonderful Ivy Bookshop in Baltimore, two great
Okay.
independents.
You can buy them at those bookstores also. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. This interview will live forever on the Mighty Blaze YouTube channel, so you can watch it there and add comments there. It's also on a Mighty Blaze Facebook page. Thank you all for being here. Thank our wonderful producer, Ollie, and most of all, Alice. This has been on my bucket list to be able to talk with you, and I'm just so happy. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you for Mighty Blaze. This is a
You're
marvelous thing you're
welcome.
doing
You're
for all of
welcome.
us.
And we'll see you all later. Bye.
Here.